pregnant woman disappears on Christmas Eve. A mother parties for 31 days while her child lies dead. And a killer, who thought he'd gotten away for 40 years, is caught by a single drop of DNA. What you're about to hear will change the way you see justice forever. These are the true crime stories that haunted America, but were finally solved, just not the way you'd expect. The Perfect Life, Laci Peterson. She was 8 months pregnant, glowing, smiling, preparing for her first Christmas as a mother. Laci Denise Peterson had everything she ever wanted. A beautiful home in Modesto, California, a golden retriever named Mackenzie, and a husband who, on the surface, seemed perfect. Scott Peterson was young, good-looking, and ran a successful fertilizer business. The couple appeared in local newspapers, photographed at charity events. They were the couple next door. But behind that perfect image, something darker was growing. On the morning of December 24, 2002, Laci got dressed, said goodbye to her husband, and took the dog for a walk. That's what Scott told police anyway. By nightfall, her family was in full panic. Laci hadn't answered her phone. The dog was found wandering alone, with its leash still attached. And Laci, gone. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, no explanation. Just a woman who vanished, days before giving birth. At first, it looked like a tragic accident, a pregnant woman lost. But what investigators found next would turn a missing persons case into one of the most sensational murder trials in American history. Christmas in Modesto came with a strange silence that year. As the world unwrapped presents and gathered around dinner tables, the Peterson house sat still, its decorations untouched, the lights glowing over an empty crib. The first 24 hours in any missing persons case are crucial. But this one? It moved fast. When Laci didn't show up for the family's Christmas Eve dinner, her stepfather called 911. Within hours, officers were at the house, flyers were printed, search teams were dispatched. But something felt off, right from the beginning. Scott Peterson told police he had gone fishing alone that morning at the Berkeley Marina, over 90 miles away. Strange choice, considering it was a cold December morning, and his wife was due to give birth any day. He said he'd returned around 5 p.m., found the house empty, the dog in the backyard, and assumed Laci had gone to her mother's. But Laci's purse was still inside, her car in the driveway, and her keys, untouched. And then neighbors started talking. A woman said she saw Laci walking the dog that morning, around 10:15 a.m. Another neighbor said the dog was found in the street, alone, by 10:30, which left a narrow window and a chilling timeline. Investigators dug deeper, a pattern began to emerge. Scott's story didn't change, but it also didn't quite hold up. His alibi placed him on a boat, on a bay, right near the very place where something devastating would later surface. In the days that followed, over 1,500 volunteers joined the search. Helicopters scanned the skies, divers combed the waters, but there were no signs of Laci, no cries for help, no ransom notes, just silence, until someone came forward with a secret. One that would shatter the image of the perfect husband and flip the entire case upside down. Just when the public began to rally around the grieving husband, a quiet voice emerged from the shadows. Her name was Amber Frey, a 27-year-old. Massage therapist from Fresno, California, Amber had no idea who Laci Peterson was until she turned on the news. What she saw on the screen made her knees buckle. There, in front of cameras, was the man she'd been dating for weeks, the man who took her to dinner, the man who held her daughter's hand, Scott Peterson. But Scott had introduced himself to Amber as a widower, not a man whose pregnant wife had just disappeared, and definitely not a man the country had begun to suspect. Amber contacted police immediately, and what happened next would become a turning point in the investigation. Investigators asked her to wear a wire. For weeks, she recorded phone calls with Scott. calls that would eventually reveal chilling truths. On December 31st, while Laci's family held a vigil for her and the unborn baby, Scott was on the phone with Amber. He told her he was in Paris, alone, mourning. But in reality, Scott was just a few miles away, standing in the middle of a candlelit crowd, pretending to be a devastated husband. The mask had cracked. Public opinion shifted overnight. What once looked like a tragic disappearance now smelled like premeditation. The story exploded. Every major news outlet followed the case. Satellite trucks lined the streets outside the Peterson home. And Amber, she became a reluctant face of justice. "I was deceived," she told reporters. "I had to do what was right, but even as suspicion mounted, there was still no physical evidence, no body, no weapon, just whispers, circumstance, lies." Until April 13th, 2003, almost 4 months after Laci vanished, when a passerby made a gruesome discovery on the rocky shoreline of the San Francisco Bay. It was the body of a late-term male fetus. The next day, just 1 mile away, the decomposed torso of an adult woman surfaced. DNA confirmed what everyone feared. It was Laci, and the unborn son she was going to name Connor. What investigators found next would leave no doubt about what really happened. April 18th, 2003. Scott Peterson was sitting in his silver Mercedes-Benz, parked near a golf course in La Jolla, California. But this wasn't a casual outing. His hair had been dyed blonde. He carried $15,000 in cash, multiple cell phones, a map to the Canadian border, camping gear, and his brother's ID. To the police, it was obvious. He was preparing to run. That morning, the arrest was swift. Officers surrounded the vehicle and placed Scott in handcuffs. The media exploded. Headlines screamed, "Husband arrested in Laci Peterson murder." And just hours after his arrest, the bodies of Laci and baby Connor were officially identified. The timing was no coincidence. Prosecutors charged Scott with 2 counts of murder, one for Laci and one for his unborn son. He pled not guilty, and what followed would become one of the most closely watched trials of the 21st century. Crowds gathered daily outside the courtroom. News anchors analyzed every detail, his expression, his clothes, his body language. But it wasn't just the facts of the case that gripped the country. It was the betrayal. The man who played the role of grieving husband had deceived everyone. Friends, family, the entire nation. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution laid out a narrative of premeditation, that Scott wanted freedom. That the affair with Amber Frey wasn't just a fling, it was motive. That the fishing trip to the Berkeley Marina wasn't innocent. It was a cover. They showed how the bodies surfaced exactly where Scott had gone that day, how his alibi unraveled. But the defense fought back. No murder weapon, no eyewitness, no forensic evidence directly tying Scott to the crime, just suspicion. For months, the trial dragged on, until the jury heard Amber Frey's recordings, her voice trembling, his voice calm, cold, calculated. The contrast was too much, and in November 2004, the verdict came in, guilty on both counts. And then, the sentence, death. The courtroom erupted, tears, cheers, silence. For many it felt like justice, but for others, it raised even more questions. Years have passed since the guilty verdict. Scott Peterson now sits on death row at San Quentin State Prison, isolated from the world he once fooled. But the story didn't end there. In the years following the trial, new voices began to speak out, not to defend Scott's character, but to question the process. Did media hysteria influence the jury? Were crucial pieces of evidence ignored? Was this truly justice? Or just a man condemned in the court of public opinion? Legal analysts and true crime investigators pointed to inconsistencies in the timeline, the lack of forensic evidence, the failure to test certain items. Even Laci's own family began to split in their beliefs. Some held firm. Scott was guilty, no question. Others wondered, could someone else have been involved? In 2020, California's Supreme Court overturned Scott Peterson's death sentence due to significant errors during jury selection. A technicality, but one that reignited national interest in the case. A retrial for sentencing was ordered, and with it came a flood of renewed emotion. Amber Frey, now a private citizen, remained silent. Laci's parents, older, still grieved the daughter they lost. And the public? Still torn. Some call it the ultimate betrayal of trust. Others call it a tragic mystery still clouded in doubt. But for all the headlines, all the trials, all the theories, one thing remains painfully clear. A young woman and her unborn child are gone. And a nation, captivated by the story, still struggles to answer the most haunting question of all. Why? Why did Scott Peterson, a man with a good job, a beautiful wife, a child on the way, throw it all away? Was it fear, ego, cold calculation, or something darker that we may never truly understand? As we close this chapter, we're left with a case that echoes louder than its verdict. A case that reminds us how quickly trust can turn to terror. How the perfect life can be a perfect lie. And how even the clearest answers can still leave shadows. What do you believe happened? Let us know in the comments. And remember, some stories may be solved, but they're never really over. The 31 Days, Caylee Anthony. When Caylee Marie Anthony disappeared, no one knew. Not the police, not the media, not even her grandparents, who saw her almost every day. Why? Because for 31 days, her mother, Casey Anthony, said nothing. No phone call. No missing persons report. Just silence. During that time, Casey continued to live her life as if nothing had happened. She went out partying, posted on MySpace, got a tattoo that read, La Bella Vita, the beautiful life. But Caylee was gone. It wasn't until Cindy Anthony, Caylee's grandmother, dialed 911 that the world even learned the little girl was missing. It smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car, Cindy told the dispatcher, referring to Casey's trunk, and just like that, the perfect lie unraveled. When questioned, Casey claimed her daughter had been kidnapped by a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez. But police quickly found out there was no nanny. No Zenaida. It was all made up. Detectives were left chasing shadows, and every trail led straight back to Casey, but without a body and without clear evidence, no one could prove what really happened to Caylee. Not yet. Still, one thing was clear. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. As detectives dug deeper into Casey Anthony's life during the 31 days her daughter was missing, what they found wasn't grief, it was celebration. While the world would expect a mother to be frantic, desperate, begging for help, Casey was spotted at nightclubs, dancing with friends, entering hot body contests, and smiling in photos like nothing was wrong. Her MySpace posts were filled with quotes about freedom, about living life with no regrets, and not once did she mention Caylee. It was as if her daughter had never existed. The contrast was haunting. At one point, she even borrowed a shovel from a neighbor, claiming she needed it to dig up a root. Investigators began building a timeline, and the pieces didn't fit. On June 27th, she was seen at a club. On July 2nd, she got her tattoo. On July 5th, she was photographed at a party wearing a short dress and high heels. Meanwhile, text messages surfaced where she casually talked about drinking and needing to escape. There was no sign of a frantic mother, only someone who seemed liberated. The media caught wind, and the public turned. News networks played footage of her dancing while overlaying photos of Caylee's innocent face. The country was outraged. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was the making of a national scandal, but the real horror was yet to come. On December 11, 2008, 6 months after Caylee Anthony was last seen alive, a utility worker stepped out to relieve himself near a wooded area not far from the Anthony family home. What he found would change everything. Hidden among the underbrush was a small garbage bag. Inside, a skull. Not just any skull, but one that still had pieces of duct tape stretched across the jaw. Nearby, police found a baby blanket and tiny bones scattered by animals. DNA confirmed what everyone feared. It was Caylee. The medical examiner couldn't determine an exact cause of death. Too much time had passed, and the remains were severely decomposed. But what haunted investigators was the duct tape. 3. Strips, carefully placed, and in Casey's car, cadaver dogs had previously alerted to the smell of decomposition in the trunk. Hair samples from Caylee were also recovered inside. The evidence was mounting. Yet, with no eyewitness, no surveillance footage, and no definitive cause of death, prosecutors knew the case wouldn't be easy. But the trial that followed, it would divide an entire nation. On May 24, 2011, the trial of Caylee Anthony began, broadcast live every day into millions of homes. Prosecutors painted her as a liar, a narcissist, and a murderer who wanted freedom from motherhood. The motive? To return to a carefree life of partying and dating. They showed photos of Caylee entering nightclubs, laughing with friends, and getting a Bella Vita tattoo, which means beautiful life, just days after Caylee disappeared. They introduced the duct tape, the smell in the trunk, the internet searches for chloroform, and how to make neck-breaking tools found on the Anthony family computer. The evidence was disturbing, but circumstantial, and the defense used that to their advantage. In a stunning opening statement, they claimed Caylee hadn't been murdered at all. She had drowned in the family pool, and Casey's father, George Anthony, helped cover it up out of panic and past abuse. No solid proof was offered. Just reasonable doubt. Jurors were shocked, so was the public. The prosecution's case unraveled as expert testimony clashed. One moment, the air in the car was said to smell like human decay. The next, another expert claimed it was just trash. The prosecution never established exactly how Caylee died. And on July 5, 2011, after 10 hours of deliberation, the verdict came in, not guilty. Caylee Anthony was acquitted of murder, manslaughter, and child abuse. The world exploded. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse. Commentators wept on air. Many felt justice had been denied, but others wondered, had the system simply done its job? Even after the verdict, the mystery surrounding Caylee Anthony's death refused to fade. What really happened to Caylee, the public, remained divided. Some believed Caylee got away with murder. Others saw her as a deeply troubled young woman, failed by a dysfunctional family. Over time, new pieces emerged. In interviews and documentaries, jurors explained their decision. They felt something terrible had happened. But there simply wasn't enough proof to convict beyond a reasonable doubt. In 2017, Caylee finally broke her silence. "I don't give a shit what anyone thinks about me," she said in one interview. But others close to the case kept talking. Caylee's grandparents, George and Cindy, gave emotional interviews. George, once accused by Casey's defense, maintained his innocence and continued to ask one question: why didn't she call for help? Caylee's case changed the national conversation. It sparked outrage, new legislation, and countless podcasts and documentaries. But one thing remained clear. The truth died with Caylee, and whatever happened that day in Orlando left a scar on an entire generation. A decade of terror. At first, it was just whispers, a break-in here, a missing pet there. But then, the screams began. Between 1974 and 1986, California became the hunting ground for one of the most terrifying criminals in U.S. history. He stalked suburban neighborhoods, he studied his victims, and when the time was right, he struck. He was called many names. In Sacramento, they knew him as the East Area Rapist, a masked man who broke into homes, tied up couples, and left behind shattered lives. In Southern California, he became the original Night Stalker, responsible for brutal murders that haunted entire communities. For decades, no one realized. They were the same man. His method was cold and calculated. He would call his victims beforehand, sometimes after. He'd whisper threats, laugh, promise to return. Over 50 rapes. At least 13 murders, hundreds of lives destroyed. But in 1986, just as suddenly as he appeared, he vanished. No one knew who he was, no fingerprints, no name, no face. But the pain he left behind never faded. And decades later, a drop of DNA would finally expose the monster. After 1986, it was as if he simply evaporated. No new attacks, no new leads, just silence. The media moved on, detectives retired. The case files grew cold, but for the survivors and the families of those who were killed, the silence was deafening. They waited, hoped, replayed the same. Horrifying nights over and over again in their minds. Each anniversary brought back fresh pain. Each dead end felt like a betrayal. They asked, how could a man do all this and disappear? The fear never really left because the monster was still out there. Some theorized he had died. Others believed he was still alive, watching as the world tried and failed to catch him. Investigators combed through thousands of tips. Every lead led nowhere. Every clue was a brick wall. It seemed like he had beaten the system. But then, in a quiet lab, decades later, science caught up. And what came next would rewrite the rules of criminal justice forever. Started with a sample, just a swab. Investigators, desperate for answers, turned to a tool no one expected. Genealogy websites. Specifically, GEDmatch, a platform where people uploaded their DNA to find relatives. But what if, instead of finding a cousin, you found a killer? They uploaded DNA from the crime scenes, DNA that had sat in evidence lockers for over 4 decades. The results came back not a direct match, but close. A family tree began to take shape. Cousins, uncles, grandparents. Piece by piece, they worked backwards until only one name remained. Joseph James D'Angelo, a retired police officer, a father, a man living a quiet life in a California suburb. The Golden State Killer had worn a badge. They surveilled him for weeks, watched him take out his trash, waited for the perfect moment, and then they took his discarded items, tested them, DNA match. 100%. After 44 years, the mask came off. The man who had terrorized California for a decade was now a gray-haired grandfather. The arrest shocked the nation. But what came after would finally bring justice to dozens of families. The courtroom was silent. Dozens of victims, families who had waited decades for this day. When Joseph D'Angelo entered, he was a shell of the monster they remembered. Frail, quiet, sitting in a wheelchair. But the truth was undeniable. In a deal to avoid the death penalty, D'Angelo confessed to 13 murders and dozens of rapes and burglaries. The details he gave were chilling. Names, dates, places. And with every word, the pain resurfaced. One by one, survivors stood before him. A woman, now in her 60s, trembling as she faced the man who had shattered her childhood. A father, eyes burning with rage, speaking for his daughter who never got to grow up. "You tried to steal my voice," one survivor said. "But I'm speaking now." D'Angelo never looked up. No apology, no emotion, just silence. The judge's voice echoed through the room, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The victims cheered, cried, held each other. It wasn't closure, but it was justice. After 44 years, the nightmare was finally over, at least for some. The arrest of Joseph DeAngelo did more than bring a killer to justice. It revolutionized criminal investigations. The key to solving the case? A public genealogy website. GetMatch.investigators submitted a DNA profile from a decades-old crime scene, and within weeks, a partial match was found, not to DeAngelo directly, but to a distant cousin. From there, a family tree was built, generation by generation, until one name stood out: a former police officer, a quiet man living in a suburban California neighborhood. Joseph James DeAngelo. The arrest stunned the world, not just for who he was, but for how they found him. Forensics was no longer limited to fingerprints and blood. It had entered a new era, one where genetic breadcrumbs could lead to justice, even decades later. Since then, dozens of cold cases have been cracked using the same technique. Victims once forgotten, now finally heard. But the case also sparked ethical debates. How far is too far when it comes to accessing personal DNA? Can the pursuit of justice violate the right to privacy? The answers are still unfolding. But one thing is clear: science gave victims a voice, and in the case of the Golden State Killer, that voice was loud, clear, and unstoppable. 3 lives, 3 cases, one undeniable truth: the line between justice and injustice is often razor thin. Laci Peterson, a glowing mother-to-be, whose dream of a perfect family was shattered by the man who promised to protect her. Kaylee Anthony, an innocent child whose disappearance sparked national outrage, and whose mother's trial left a permanent scar on America's faith in its own justice system. And the Golden State Killer, a shadow that haunted California for decades, until science finally gave a name to the monster. These aren't just stories, they're real. People, with birthdays, favorite songs, and dreams that were stolen. Some found justice, others, we're still not sure. But one thing connects them all: the power of truth. Even when buried beneath years of lies, covered by fame or fear, the truth doesn't stay hidden forever. And sometimes, it only takes one voice, one journalist, one investigator, one piece of DNA to unravel the silence. These cases remind us of the fragility of life and the strength it takes to demand answers. Because in a world where monsters sometimes wear familiar faces, we have to keep asking questions, and we have to keep listening to the victims, to the families, to the truths no one wants to face. If this video moved you, don't let these stories fade. Subscribe to our channel for more true crime investigations. Like the video to support more content like this. And in the comments, tell us which of these stories impacted you the most. Do you believe justice was truly served in each case? Your voice matters, and your story might help someone else find the courage to speak out too.